The night air was thick with tension, the kind that settles over a place before violence takes root. The town of Briar's Hollow had always been a quiet refuge, a place where people built lives with their own hands, raised families, and carved out a small corner of peace in a world that often refused to give it to them. But that peace was about to be shattered. They came with fire, with hate, with 30 men carrying rifles and torches, expecting to find easy conquest, a town too small, too isolated, too weak to fight back. But what they didn't know was that Briar's Hollow wasn't unprotected. Dane Calloway, once known as Shadow in the military, had spent years ending threats before they even knew he was there. Eli Graves, a sniper who never missed when it mattered, watched from the rooftops, patient as death itself. Colt Ramirez, a demolitions expert who could turn arrogance into smoking rubble, was already setting traps. And Jonah Vance, a combat medic who had seen too much blood to let spill on his watch, stood ready to keep their people alive. This wasn't just another act of hate. This was war. And Briar's Hollow wasn't going down without a fight. The last rays of the sun bathed Briar's Hollow in deep amber, shadows stretching long across the quiet streets. The smell of barbecue and fresh bread drifted through the air, mixing with the sound of laughter from the town square. Dane walked alongside Eli, Colt, and Jonah, their boots light on the pavement as they took in a sight of kids playing on porches, elders chatting over cold drinks, and shopkeepers closing up for night. "It's peaceful," Eli muttered, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. Dane nodded, though he knew better than to believe in peace that lasted. The world didn't work that way. And then they heard it. Engines. A deep, guttural roar, the kind that didn't belong in a place like this. The kind that only carried bad news. They turned just in time to see the trucks rolling in, dust kicking up behind them like a storm sweeping in from hell. Big wheels, tinted windows, flags snapping in the wind, American, Confederate, and something else, something new. Guns leaned against dashboards. Men in the truck beds laughed like they already owned the place. Something about the way they moved, fast, reckless, too sure of themselves, made Dane's stomach tighten. Colt adjusted the knife at his belt. "Guess we're working tonight." The truck sped past, disappearing toward the town's edge. But they didn't leave without making their mark. A man lay in the dirt where they had passed. Old, too old to be treated this way. His white shirt was stained with blood, his glasses broken beside him. Reverend Ezekiel Carter. Jonah was the first to move, dropping to his knees beside the old man, hands already working to check his injuries. Dane crouched beside them, voice steady. "Who did this?" Ezekiel's fingers twitched against Jonah's wrist, gripping with what little strength he had left. His voice came out a whisper, hoarse and ragged. "They said this town ain't ours no more." Silence. A long, slow-burning silence, the kind that settled right before a trigger was pulled. Dane stood, rolling his shoulders, his jaw tight. Colt exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Guess we ain't done with us after all." Eli's eyes followed the direction the trucks had gone, his voice like broken glass. "So let's find out who just signed their death warrant." Jonah pressed a damp cloth to Ezekiel's temple, his hand steady despite the storm brewing inside him. The old man winced but said nothing, breathing slow and deliberate, as if he knew any sudden movement might unravel the fragile hold he had over his pain. They had brought him to the town's small clinic, where Dr. Miriam Wallace, a no-nonsense woman with steel-gray hair and decades of experience, worked quickly to check his injuries. Dane leaned against the wall, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room. He took in every detail, the torn shirt, the bloodied lip, the swelling along Ezekiel's jaw. This wasn't a random beating. This was a warning. Eli stood near the window, his sharp gaze locked onto the street outside, watching, waiting, the way he always did when he knew a fight was coming. Colt paced near the door, exhaling through his nose. "You gonna tell us what happened, Reverend? Or do we have to start making some guesses?" Ezekiel's fingers twitched against the edge of the examination table. "They said Briar's Hollow was a mistake," the old man murmured. Dane's gut tightened. He already knew who they were. "The Blood Vultures," Ezekiel said, his voice quieter now, but no less certain. "That's what they call themselves." The name settled into the air like a bad omen. Colt muttered under his breath, Sounds like another internet group with too much hate and not enough spine. Ezekiel chuckled weakly. They ain't just talking, son. They're doing. Dane stepped forward, his voice quiet but heavy. What did they say? Ezekiel swallowed. They told me we built something in a place where we didn't belong. That our town, our families, our history was a stain. And they were going to wipe it clean. Darius exhaled sharply, shaking his head. They ever come like this before? Ezekiel nodded, just barely. Started small. Broken windows. Slashed tires. Then a house burned down last month. Miss Avery's place. Dane felt something cold settle in his chest. He had seen this before, in other places, other wars. Terror wasn't about the first strike. It was about making people feel helpless. He turned to Eli. Sheriff know about this? Eli let out a humorless laugh. Oh, he knows. He just don't care. Dane clenched his jaw. How many of them are there? Ezekiel exhaled. Enough. Dane met Eli's gaze. We need to find out exactly how many, what they have, who's backing them. Colt cracked his knuckles, and what their next move is. Ezekiel's gaze turned dark. You sure you want to get involved in this, son? This ain't your war. Dane didn't hesitate. It is now. Dane moved through the streets like a shadow. Most of the town had settled in for the night. Doors locked, lights dimmed, but the unease in the air was thick enough to choke on. Sheriff Travis Tate had been a dead end, a man who sat behind his desk with his feet up, flipping through a hunting magazine while Dane asked about the Blood Vultures. No evidence, Tate had shrugged. Boys being boys. Dane hadn't pressed him. Tate was the kind of man who waited until the smoke cleared, so he could pretend he'd been neutral all along. So Dane went somewhere else. The Last Stop bar sat on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where men whisper about taking back their country over cheap beer. Dane stepped inside. The bartender, Buck Rollins, narrowed his eyes. Kane, didn't think this was your kind of place. Dane ignored the bait. I'm looking for information. Buck exhaled through his nose, wiping down the counter. Name rings a bell. Dane leaned in. I'm listening. Buck considered him, then sighed. They don't just want to scare you, he said. They want to erase you. Dane's gut tightened, and they're bringing more men. The war was already here, and Briar's Hollow was about to fight like hell. Dane stood at the edge of town, staring down the dirt road where Buck had said reinforcements were coming. The horizon was empty for now, but it wouldn't be for long. Behind him, Briar's Hollow was already shifting. People who had never picked up a gun before now held them tight in trembling hands. Old hunters checked their rifles. Young men and women took their places near barricades hastily built from overturned trucks and sandbags. No one wanted this fight, but no one was running either. Inside Dane's house, the four of them gathered around the kitchen table. Colt had a map spread out, marking ambush points, bottlenecks, escape routes. Eli cleaned his rifle with the quiet, methodical patience of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. Jonah sorted through medical supplies, his jaw tight. We don't have enough people, Jonah muttered. We don't need more people, Eli replied, loading his sniper rounds. We need them to be smarter. Dane looked up. Then we teach them. They spent the next 2 hours moving through the town, preparing. Dane worked with those willing to fight, showing them how to use cover, how to reload under pressure, how to breathe when the fear set in. Eli climbed to the rooftops, scoping out vantage points. Every street, every alley, every open field. He knew exactly where he needed to be. Colt and a few volunteers set up traps, small explosives hid in the dirt, gas cans rigged to ignite if a bullet hit them, spike strips laid across the road. Jonah worked with the elderly and children, making sure they knew where to hide, how to stay quiet, how to bandage a wound if help didn't come fast enough. By the time the sun had started to set, Briar's Hollow wasn't just a town anymore. It was a fortress. Then Eli's voice crackled over the radio. They're here. Engines roared in the distance. A convoy of trucks, vans, and motorcycles toured down the road toward town, kicking up dust in the dying light. From his rooftop perch, Eli counted at least 50 men, twice as many as before. They're bringing everything, he murmured. Dane crouched behind a stack of crates, gripping his rifle. He could hear the town breathing around him, nervous, shifting, quiet prayers, fingers tightening on triggers. The Blood Vultures had come expecting prey. They were about to meet predators. The first truck rolled over the spike strips. Its tires shredded instantly, sending the vehicle skidding sideways into a ditch. Before the men inside could react, Eli fired. His first shot punched through the windshield, taking out the driver of the second truck. The vehicle veered wildly, smashing into a fence post. Then Colt hit the detonator. A row of buried explosives erupted beneath the road, flipping 2 more trucks into the air. Fire and shrapnel rained down, sending bodies flying. Shouts of panic filled the air, but the Blood Vultures didn't retreat. They adapted. Men jumped from the remaining vehicles, using them as cover. Rifles snapped to shoulders. Then the gunfight began. Bullets tore through wooden fences and shattered windows. The people of Briar's Hollow fired back, ducking behind cover, aiming carefully. Dane moved like a shadow, weaving through the alleys, firing short, controlled bursts. Every shot counted. Colt worked from a rooftop, dropping homemade Molotovs onto the attackers below, setting the ground ablaze. Jonah was everywhere at once, pulling wounded civilians out of line of fire, patching up injuries on the fly. And Eli was death itself. Every time a Blood Vulture tried to take control of the battlefield, a single shot rang out, and they dropped. One by one, their numbers dwindled. Then, a new voice cut through the commotion. "Hold your fire." Dane turned toward the sound. A man stood in the middle of the street, arms outstretched like he owned the world. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face lined with old scars. He didn't wear a mask. He wanted them to see him. Dane recognized the real leader of the Blood Vultures immediately. "You must be Calloway," the man said, his voice carrying over the battlefield. "I've heard about you." Dane didn't answer. He just raised his rifle. The leader grinned. "That's not a smart move, soldier." Then he nodded toward the darkness behind him. Shouts rang out. Hostages! The Blood Vultures had taken some of the town's people during the chaos. 12 of them. Hands bound, guns at their backs. Dane's stomach turned to ice. "You fight well," the leader continued. "But now we have something you don't. A choice." Dane clenched his jaw. He knew how these men worked. They wanted fear. Eli's voice crackled in his earpiece. "We can take them." Dane exhaled. "Not without casualties." The leader smirked. "Here's the deal. You let us walk out of here, we let them go." Colt's hands curled into fists. "We should kill every last one of them." But Dane wasn't looking at the leader anymore. He was looking at the boy and the group of hostages. The kid's eyes flicked to the ground. Then to Dane. Dane saw it before it even happened. The boy grabbed a rock from the dirt and threw it. The rock cracked against the leader's temple. For 1 second, the world stopped. Then Dane moved. Gunfire erupted. The leader stumbled back, cursing. Dane lunged, slamming into him before he could recover. They crashed into the dirt, fists flying. The Blood Vultures panicked. The hostages broke into a run, diving for cover. Eli and Colt opened fire, picking off the distracted gunmen. Jonah dragged a wounded man behind a car, pressing a cloth to his bleeding shoulder. "Stay with me." Dane and the leader rolled through the dirt, trading brutal blows. The man was strong, but Dane was faster. He dodged a wild punch and slammed an elbow into the man's throat. The leader gasped, staggering. Dane didn't give him time to recover. He drove a knee into his ribs, then grabbed him by the collar, hauling him up. The leader spat blood. "This ain't over." Dane stared into his eyes. "Yeah, it is." Then he slammed the man's head against the hood of the car. The leader collapsed. The battle was over. The Blood Vultures were broken. The few who survived ran. By the time the sun rose, Briar's Hollow still stood. The townspeople gathered in the square, bruised, exhausted, but alive. Mayor Sarah Carter stepped forward. "What now?" Dane exhaled. "Now we prepare." Eli crossed his arms. "They'll send more." Jonah looked around at the people who had fought for their home and won. "They won't take this town," Jonah murmured. Not now. Not ever. Colt lit a cigarette. Then let's get to work. The people of Briar's Hollow had been tested. They had survived. And next time, they'd be the ones ready to strike first.